At Subway, start your day the flavorful way by adding new guacamole to your favorite breakfast sandwich. Perfectly made with a hint of jalapeno, our guacamole turns up the flavor to your breakfast. Try it today on a hot and toasty egg, white, and cheese. Subway, eat fresh.
The BS Report is a free-flowing conversation that occasionally touches on mature subjects. The BS Report. The BS Report with Bill Simmons.
Welcome to the BS Report. This is something that we taped a while ago. Actually, it was last spring. A long interview with Alex Gibney, who directed a movie that's out right now called The Armstrong Lie about Lance Armstrong. And here's the story behind this. He did not know if he was going to get Lance Armstrong for an interview for the documentary or not. So as kind of a safety valve situation for his movie, he decided to do something where we did a long podcast about Lance Armstrong. And if the Armstrong interview fell through for some reason, he was going to use some of the footage from our interview to kind of help move along the story, because he had some pieces that, you know, needed to be clarified or whatever. And he was just going to use himself basically as the narrator through this interview. And we decided whether or not he used the interview in the documentary, we would save it and run it as a podcast when the movie came out. So what happened was Lance Armstrong eventually decided to give the interview. So Alex didn't need to use this interview in the documentary, but we can still run it as a podcast. So that's the context behind it. Alex was also, he's one of the 3 best documentary directors in the country. So this is the interview that we did with him that we're about to run. One thing, I wanted to give a shout out to our sponsor, Stamps.com. The holidays are coming. You got to mail stuff. You got to mail presents. You got to mail cards. You got to do all that stuff. This is when waiting in line at the post office becomes a nightmare. So why even wait in line? Go to Stamps.com. You can put in BS in the special sign-in box, and that gives you a deal on a whole bunch of stuff, and $55 off free postage and a scale, everything that's going to help you out with not ever having to go to the post office again. Check that out, Stamps.com. Thanks for sponsoring us, and now our interview with Alex Gibney.
Welcome to the BS Report, taping this on April 24th. 2013. I don't know when it's running, but here's Alex Gibney, who directs a lot of documentaries. He's probably the single best documentarian filmmaker, I think. You're on the list. I know. Now you're acting all embarrassed.
Yeah, I am.
For the last 4 years, you've been working on this Lance Armstrong documentary that you basically spent all of 2009 working on. And you're one of those guys, you're always working on 2 or 3 things at once.
Right.
You're kind of like me. We're kind of wired the same way.
That's right.
I get bored unless I'm doing 5 things at once.
That's right.
You always have 3 things going. This became one of your things. You normally pick things that aren't going to be commercial type things.
Right.
They're more, I don't know what the right word is. Smart, creative, whatever. This had the chance to be both.
Right.
Here's this fascinating guy, but he's also famous. Like, this is a documentary that could be really cool, but you could also sell.
Right.
You finish it. What happens next?
Suddenly, Tyler Hamilton appears on 60 Minutes. And the next thing you know, we have a federal investigation into a possible indictment into Lance Armstrong for, we don't know what the charges were, but suddenly it's clear that people are coming out of the woodwork and saying Lance Armstrong doped. And he had been denying it for years, had been scuttlebutt about it for years, but suddenly it gets really big. And now there's a federal investigation. And so Floyd Landis then comes out, and he starts talking about how much he knew about Lance Armstrong's doping. And Jeff Nowitzki, the same guy who went after Barry Bonds, suddenly is at the heart of this federal investigation. So suddenly the film about Lance Armstrong's 2009 comeback has to be put on the shelf.
So you think you're making this, it's a sports story, but it's about a hero, and it's about a guy who's beating the odds. He's trying to come back. It's got all the elements that we would like almost in a sports movie.
Right. A classic sports film.
Yes.
And then it turns upside down. Now, mind you, it wasn't like in the film I was doing, the film I thought I was doing, it was about a guy with will, like the will to win that is above and beyond, both from a good perspective and a bad perspective. In other words, if it's win at all costs. He used to have an expression, win, lose, live, die.
Yeah.
Well, it's not, if you're on his team, you're thinking that's great. But you're sort of thinking, well, winning and losing and living and dying normally don't really have to go together.
So usually when you pick your films, it's usually something that could be described like in one sentence or even a lot of times one word. So the thing that appealed to you in this one, I'm guessing, is that word will.
Correct. That was it for me. Because Lance Armstrong seemed to have that will. After all, that's what I think motivated all the cancer survivors, that somehow there was an intangible factor, this will to live. Now, we don't know why somebody survives cancer and why somebody else doesn't, but will seems to be a pretty important thing. It's hope in some ways, when you're facing death. So that will to win, that will to live, seemed pretty powerful in the case of Lance Armstrong.
And was all part of the same package.
Right. But then the question was, in that will to win at any cost, was he taking the magic sauce?
Yeah, is it like a faucet where you can turn it off when it comes to the point of PDs? And you're a smart guy. You're going into this with an open mind for the most part, but in the back of your mind, you're thinking, this is a sport where everybody cheats. And here's this guy who battled back from cancer, who allegedly wasn't cheating, and is beating all the people who were cheating. Like, on paper, this doesn't pass the smell test.
No, and it never did, really, for me. I mean, but you could never say it out loud because he had never failed a test. And frankly, we look back now and we think, oh, my God, the USADA reasoned decision and all of that. It's just incredible, all this stuff that everybody dug out. That had been around for a long time. A lot of people were saying Lance was doping, but nobody really wanted to pay attention. And I think one of the things Lance had going for him was that he was a great storyteller. And he told a story that everybody wanted to believe in, whether you're a cancer survivor or whether you're Nike. It was so powerful. It was maybe the greatest sports story ever.
Right.
The guy who comes back from near death to win the Tour de France 7 times. And he does it clean, or so he says. And because Lance didn't just say, I never passed the test. I mean, I never failed a test. He didn't just say, I never failed a test. He looked you in the eye and said, I have never doped.
And he was defiant about it, which I personally think, this is going to sound funny, but I think he was the greatest cheater of all time. He had the most sophisticated system. Like, the more you read about it, there was so much thought and precision and care put into how they cheated. And then on top of that, he was so good at lying about it that it didn't pass the smell test for me, but he was so adamant that he didn't cheat. And I always thought, if I was in the same position, this is how I would act. I'd be like, not only did I not cheat, I'm suing everybody who says I'm cheating. I'm going to look you in the eye. I'm gonna stand on my own merits. And I got to admit, I'm somewhat of a trusting person. Like, he kind of had me hooked a little bit. I was like, maybe he didn't cheat. Maybe he's just superhuman. And that's the thing we've learned with sports, is that when somebody seems superhuman, they're usually not.
Correct. And the other thing we learn about sports, too, is that it's that need to want to believe that that person is superhuman. That's what gets us. Right. Because I found out, in the middle of the 2009 tour, all the stuff I knew about Lance, and I'm a pretty cynical guy. I mean, I have done, films about Enron and, torture in the Bush administration and the Elliot Spitzer, sex scandal. But I'm on Mont Ventoux, the penultimate stage of the 2009 tour, and Lance is coming up the mountain, and I'm going, yes, come on, Lance, yes.
Yeah.
Got to have you on that podium, man. I was hooked.
Yeah.
I got to have my ending.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, part of you has to root for that.
Of course.
It's more the film's going to do better if he's in first place than 7th place.
Well, he was never going to be in first place. I mean, that was the problem. He had already been spanked by this guy Contador, but to stay on the podium for a 39-year-old, that was going to be pretty big. Yeah. And so for this comeback, that was going to be, a great end to the story. And so that's the thing about sports, is like we want to, and, you wrote about that in your PED piece, that suspension of disbelief that that sometimes we want to have because, I don't know.
I think it dates. I have an 8-year-old daughter and a 5.5-year-old son, and I think that is born when you're a kid, when you have Santa and the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy.
Right.
These 3 things that, and my kids are like hook, line, and sinker on all 3 of those things. Like they really genuinely believe those 3 things exist. My daughter loses a tooth. We sneak the money under the pillow. she can't believe she didn't hear the tooth fairy. So you have these things that are embedded in you and gradually you kind of give up. And then you look at something like pro wrestling, which, some adults still think half of what happens in pro wrestling is true. But especially when you're in high school, you want to believe these guys really hate each other. That guy really got hurt. And it just kind of transfers to the different sports. You saw it in baseball most famously.
Right. When the ball started flying out of the yard.
And we were like, are they juicing the balls? Why are they doing this? These balls are like golf balls. Meanwhile, these guys are just humongous.
Humongous.
And I remember, I'll never forget. I sat in Fenway in left field for the home run derby in '99, and the balls were going out of the park and onto the Mass Pike. And we were thinking, wow, these balls are really juiced. Like never occurred to us that any chicanery was going on.
Right.
As you look at this whole PED issue, was Lance? You think Lance was the tipping point, or did the tipping point happen with the baseball and bonds and all that stuff in the mid 2000s? Because now I think people are suspicious of everybody.
They are. I think now Lance was the straw that broke the camel's back. He was the last one to look everybody in the eye and say, absolutely not.
Yeah.
But we keep seeing it. I mean, Clemens did it. Clemens looked us all in the eye.
He's still doing it.
He's still doing it.
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
What's remarkable at the end of the day is that Lance finally switched. He went on Oprah and said, actually, yes, I did.
And you were there for that.
I was.
What was that day like?
Everybody was intensely nervous. And you could tell that Lance was particularly uncomfortable. Lance is unbelievably good in public situations. I mean, look, he had learned to lie so effortlessly, not only effortlessly, but with great conviction. I mean, he looks you in the eye and you believe him. But that morning, he looked nervous. He really did look nervous. And
probably not a guy who gets nervous.
No, not very often. He was nervous because I think suddenly introspection is not something that Lance does really well. So he was in a very public forum was going to be forced to be introspective. And I think, look, I think most of us can agree that the Oprah thing didn't work out so well for Lance. It didn't do what he had hoped. But if you knew Lance, and I don't know him that well, but I spent a lot of time around him, just seeing him hem and haw and be uncomfortable, that revealed, that he was in a kind of emotional turmoil, which was interesting to see.
Wow, so you had never seen him unconfident before?
No. And I had never, and Lance was always in control, seemingly. There were a few times, sometimes after moments of tremendous physical exertion, he would kind of let down his guard. But those were usually moments of real arrogance. Sometimes, occasionally, moments of disappointment. Like I saw him, in the 2009 tour on stage 15, I think, Alberto Contador really clocked him. I mean, he just rode away from everybody, and Lance looked sick. And afterwards, he was wounded. But it's rare. It's usually only after moments of tremendous physical exertion that you see that kind of honesty. The rest of the time, he's got this... he's got his face on.
What was he like after the Oprah interview? Like, did he think that went well?
I'm not sure he did. I mean, I did about a 20, 25-minute interview with him back at his house after the interview. And you can see him. It's very unusual for Lance. His shoulders are kind of slumped down. And he's talking in a very soft voice. He's talking about a lie. He said, I didn't live a lot of little lies, but I lived one big lie. And there was a kind of weight of that on his shoulders that I hadn't seen before. And you could almost physically see him slightly crumpled.
I always said this theory about O.J., that O.J. hit a point where he really didn't think he murdered his wife and a waiter because it had become this lie that had become twisted in his head to the point that he really did believe this alternate reality of what had happened.
Right.
And whether he did it or whether he was there when somebody else did it, I think we can all agree he was there when something happened. But I think now he's convinced that he wasn't. And part of me wonders, if you're living a lie like that for that long, I wonder like what the psychological state is or disorder or whatever it is where you were able to detach yourself from that lie and you're living this alternate thing and you really believe that you're not cheating when you're cheating? Does that make sense?
It does. And I thought about that a lot because, the big mystery at the heart of this film is, why did he come back? It's almost certain that none of his enemies would have risen up to go after him if he hadn't come back in 2009.
Well, how long had he been retired? Like 3 years?
Well, 2005 was the last time he ran the tour. So he was gone for 4 years, and suddenly he comes back. You're thinking, why? And so you wonder, did Lance somehow imagine, did he enter that alternate reality and somehow believe, look, it didn't matter if I doped or not back in those days, I would have won anyway, so I'm going to come back now, and I'm going to clean everybody's clock again, and I'm going to do it clean. Or so he said, or so he believed. So it's that idea that he had inhabited that alternate universe, the lie, had become true, or he was going to go back in time and he was going to make it true. In other words, if he won in 2009, then he was going to prove that he could have won all those other years without having doped.
So you think he was clean in 2009?
I don't know. He is adamant that...
well, that's that. Now already I don't believe you.
I know.
Lance is adamant. Okay, I don't believe you.
I know. He's adamant. Now, even after he said now he doped in 99 through 2005, he's now adamant that 2005 was the end. But we know from some of the blood values that it looks like he did something because you always look at the red blood cell count. Yeah. And through the course of a tour, it's supposed to go down. Yeah. Keep going down as you're getting more and more tired. But just before Mont Ventoux, the next to last stage, which is when he had his best day on the bike, goes up. Now, Lance says, well, it was because they tested me, right after the stage and I was dehydrated. I don't believe it.
It's like A-Rod when A-Rod is like, yeah, I did it, but I'm not doing it anymore and I haven't done it for a while. And then he ends up at another thing.
Right.
Usually if you did it, you're going to keep doing it.
Right.
Once a cheater, always a cheater.
Well,
I don't think there are a lot of reformed cheaters.
I think that's right. And look, I don't know. Look, like I said, Lance is adamant that he didn't. But I kind of believe that my belief, and I don't know for sure, only Lance knows for sure, but my belief is that he entered the Giro, the Italian tour, and almost everybody agrees that he was clean during the tour. Of course, he didn't do very well.
Right.
But I think he entered the Tour de France with the same expectation. He was going to do it clean, but that it got close to the end and he might have fallen off the podium, in which case the whole thing would have gone awry, right? The comeback wouldn't have meant anything. So then he makes that little bargain. He maintains he didn't. I think that's what happened.
How far back do you think he was cheating? Because I hate to say it, but it's always been a little suspicious to me that this – from everything we know about human growth hormone and steroids, blood doping, all this stuff can really have bad effects on your body, especially HGH. HGH can take whatever pre-existing cancer you have and it just blows it out. The only reason I know this was because I was thinking about taking HGH for pickup basketball for a column. I was like, I'm going to take this for 3 months. It'll be fun. And then you read about it, and it's like, oh, this is a terrible idea. Right. If I have anything in my body, it's going to blow it out.
Right.
So he gets testicular cancer in the mid-90s.
Right.
He claims he hadn't cheated at that point, but what do we know?
Well, actually, now he's admitted that prior to cancer, he was taking everything.
Oh. When did that happen?
Well, it happened on Oprah. I mean, if it was.
Did he say before? I somehow missed that.
It was not made a big deal of with Oprah, but she asked him, when did you start? He said mid-90s.
Oh, so he did. So he was ambiguous.
Which makes the whole, there's this whole thing with Betsy Andreu in the hospital room, and it makes that thing very interesting because, that was the purpose of her famous hospital room story, the idea that he admitted to the doctor that he had done all this stuff in 96. Well, he admitted in the Oprah show that he was doping in mid-90s.
The mid-90s could be like 94.
Could be.
That's like really opening
right.
the
And
window.
What Lance has said since then is that actually starting in 99, he cut down. He stopped everything except for two things, EPO and testosterone. Because he was
the two biggest things.
Well, yeah. I know, but I mean, it just shows you that in the mid-90s he was taking everything.
What else was there?
Well,
Adderall,
HGH. I mean, whatever steroids. I mean,
Dunkin' Donuts, large coffee.
Yeah, extra cream. So the works.
Now,
extra relish on the hot dog. I mean, look, there was a long list of things in that hospital room, and so he was taking it all.
I'm sure you know this. Lance is a legendary asshole. Most people, if you ask, you always talk like people ask, what is this guy like? What is that like?
Right.
Lance has the reputation of being a huge asshole. And, you know, I thought it was interesting in the Oprah interview. It was really hard for him to suppress that side.
Yes.
And, it was funny. Like, it made me think a little bit of the Michael Jordan Hall of Fame speech when people are kind of stunned by how petty and angry and over-competitive he was, and everybody knew him was like, yeah, that was the real Michael.
Right.
I don't know what you thought you were watching the last 30 years, but that's the guy that we know right there. And made me think, like, people watch that Oprah thing and they're like, God, Lance was an asshole. What's wrong with that guy? But maybe that's what he was like. Well, you spent a year with him. How close was that to what you saw?
Well, I didn't see that side of him much. And maybe it was in his interest not to show that side, because actually Lance can be very charming. He's actually a fun guy to hang out with. Personally, I
when
like
he wants
him.
to be.
When he wants to be. But I also know from talking to a lot of people, that he can be a real asshole. And actually, I frankly think that cruelty, much like the cruelty that we saw, from Michael Jordan, that's what allowed him to win. I mean, he's looking at people and he wants to beat people.
Yeah.
He wants to crush them. I mean, he doesn't want to just, I hope I win today. No, I'm going to crush that person.
And he takes slights personally, and whoever the new competitor is, he wants to destroy that guy and the whole thing.
Yeah, and he was famous. Like if you wrote for the, Idaho Bugle Intelligencer and you wrote a small column critical of Lance Armstrong, he would be on Google or he'd call you. I mean, he's Lance Armstrong. What's he calling you for? So, he was notorious for being that guy who, was ruthless with his enemies. Absolutely ruthless.
Okay, so he's a ruthless competitor who did everything it could take for an edge and eventually PEDs. You had, who's the second guy, the ruthless PED guy? Who am I thinking of?
What, in the sport?
No, just in sports. Hold on, I'm blanking. Bonds.
Barry Bonds, right.
Another guy who was wired like that,
right.
Really super competitive, who it drove him crazy that Sosa McGuire got all that attention in 98.
That's right.
And he's like, that's it, I snapped. So if you look down the line and you think of all these great athletes who have fit that stereotype, it kind of makes me suspicious of all of them, which is a terrible thing to say. But, now I look back at Michael Jordan, I think like Michael Jordan and Lance were wired the exact same way.
Right.
How do I know Michael Jordan didn't do anything? He would have, you always hear with him like, oh yeah, Michael would have done anything to win. Michael was ruthless. All he wanted to do. So now it's like what's happened with some of these guys, and Tiger's another one. Tiger in the 2000s, and wired the same way, wants to destroy everybody. And I think that the tragedy of this Lance thing and Bonds and some of these other guys is it's made me suspicious of everyone. I don't think that's fair, but it's the reality of the situation.
I think it's real. I mean, I think that's the problem. And I think if you write at large, I think the big issue is it's the overall culture. I mean, because we can't these are the guys who rise to the top because they're the ones who have the will and the determination to do whatever is necessary to win. But we like to think that we don't really cheer that on, but that's actually what we do cheer on. And certainly it's what the sponsors cheer on. I mean, I don't think Major League Baseball was blind to what was going on, with McGuire, Sosa, and everybody else. And
I don't think the NBA is blind now with their drug testing system that they have,
that
they haven't changed yet.
That's right. And certainly in cycling. I mean, Lance ruled cycling. But who heard of cycling in this country until there was Lance Armstrong? I mean, yes. There was,
so it was in their best
Greg LeMond
interest
before, but suddenly Lance Armstrong was the greatest story of all time. So it was in everybody's interest to try to look the other way. And I think a lot of the reporters who are now, vilifying Lance were the ones who were actually curating his image before.
Well, that certainly happened in baseball in the late 90s.
Right.
Everybody was writing gushing columns and books and essays about how great this was. And we're coming off the strike in 94. You lose the World Series. Is baseball dead? Then the Cal Ripken thing happens, and the home runs start happening, and oh, great, baseball's back. Everybody just looked the other way. But I wonder, and this is what I wrote about last February, like, I feel like we're still looking the other way. You know,
Right.
Ray Lewis.
Right. That's right.
Tears a tricep. He's supposed to be out 6 months. He comes back in 7 weeks. And everybody's like, wow, what an amazing warrior competitor. It's like, he just did something we've never even come close to seeing before, and nobody's saying anything.
Right.
And we don't have the stuff to test him properly. And the same thing, Terrell Suggs blows out his Achilles. He's back in record time.
Right.
And, you know, I got to be honest, like, we're taping this in April. Kobe Bryant blew out his Achilles. The doctor said 6 to 9 months to come back. I'm thinking 6 to 9 months. This is an injury that most NBA guys don't recover from at 100%. If it happens later in your career, it's usually a career ender. He's going to be back by Christmas. That doesn't make sense. And it's a league where you only have 4 drug tests a year.
Right.
That's it.
And after the 4th one, right, no more.
It's a free-for-all.
Right.
So they test you in game 60. That's your 4th test. That's it. You're not tested again. And then you have 2 random tests in the offseason. But you could look at it and say, who has more to lose from a failed PED test than the NBA? A sport that revolves around 20 stars, basically.
Right.
And the most marketable athletes of any sport, the worst thing that could happen to them would have any of those guys fail PED. They've only had 3 really high-profile PED failures in the last 5 years. None of them were all-stars.
Right.
You know, it doesn't make sense to me. There's too much money at stake. It's too easy to cheat. You also can't tell me that NBA players, like the EPO stuff, wouldn't help endurance for basketball players.
Well, it helps
To
recovery.
play 48 minutes a game
Right.
every other night, or when they do 4 games of 5 nights, EPO wouldn't help. So they don't even test for that.
Right.
We have all the blood passport stuff. How much research did you do on the blood passports and how that whole system works?
Well, everybody tells me that the the biological passport is better. I mean, It's much tougher now to beat that. I mean, and back in '99, Lance's first year, you know, when he was doing EPO, they didn't have a test for EPO. So it was easy to pass it. But I mean, even after they had tests for it, you know, they all knew how to, it's on the bottle of EPO, the instruction manual.
How to game it.
Well, you put in your veins, it passes through your body in 4 hours. So if you're doing it at night after the blood, after the testers are no longer allowed to get to you, then bingo, it's gone by morning.
And the testosterone, the sports have, they account for like 3-to-1 levels or 4-to-1 levels, depending on the sport. I want to say in cycling it was like 6-to-1 or something crazy, or football, one of those. But something that apparently a lot of the guys do, you rise your testosterone level up. They have these little patches. You put them on your balls, which sounds like a delight. How about this? Anything that goes on my balls is something I probably don't want to do.
Well, you got to think. I mean, these guys were doing. I mean, the big thing that popped up in cycling after '99, when they suddenly had a test for EPO, suddenly it was transfusions.
Yep.
And now we know the tale of 2004. You know, when Lance and the team pulls over with the bus, and everybody's strapping their blood bags, you know, to the side of the bus and transfusing on the floor.
Oh, God.
You know, I asked George Hincapie, I said, really, in the bus? He said, yeah, man, we just thought we'd bang it out in the bus before we got back to the hotel. You know, but we're talking about transfusions. And it was like, well, that's dedication.
Yeah. So you have, let's say in cycling, I forget what it was, but it was like 6-to-1 or 5-to-1, something like that. The level your testosterone could be over the average amount. You could get that testosterone up to like 4.7, and the limit's 5, and that passes the test.
Right.
So, and that's the part I don't think people understand, is you could dance really close to that line. It's almost like if you think of it like a speed limit. If they made the highway speed limit 100 miles an hour, and I drove 98, I couldn't get stopped.
Right.
But I'm going 98 miles an hour.
Well, basically, it was telling you how to cheat, because the other thing they had was, you know, we're talking about the red blood cell level. And so they had hematocrit, which measures how much hemoglobin is in your blood, basically, and how many red blood cells. And so you don't want to go over 50%. That was the rule, not over 50%. So everybody was like, oh, geez, you're 51. You better take some saline solution, get down below.
Get it to 49.8.
Right.
Yeah.
And actually, you know, Lance's team, Ferrari, the sort of Dr. Frankenstein of the doctor that helped train them and also helped to advise them in terms of what kind of drugs to take, was saying no, just to avoid detection, I actually better come back down a little bit lower than that. So but they all knew where that line was, and it was all about exactly how to cheat. So it was really a cheating guideline more than it was a way to catch people. And now, it is true that there were people in the mid-'90s who were dying, basically, from the effects of EPO because your blood would coagulate.
They ruin their blood, right?
Yeah, it would become so thick it was very hard to pump. So I think it may have been a way to make doping a little bit more safe.
The blood passports are great because the blood passports work almost like a trail of the history of your blood.
Right.
So it's like, here's Alex's blood in April, and here it is in May, and here it is in June. And if it starts going like this, something wonky is going on.
Right.
And they're going to have this for the Winter Olympics next year. And I think this is interesting. You have Lindsey Vonn, who blew out her knee, right? Blew out every ligament in her knee. She's trying to get healthy in time for the Winter Olympics. They have the passports for the Olympics. So now we get to see. There's been all this talk about how are these guys coming back in 8 months and 9 months with torn ACLs, and everybody's saying like superhuman, way ahead of the recovery. I'm not saying they cheated or they didn't cheat. I don't know. I mean, in the Adrian Peterson's case, I really do think he might have some superhuman qualities, and if anyone was going to come back sooner than average, it would be him. And Lindsey Vonn's a woman, so obviously who knows with the difference of how long that takes to recover versus a man. I don't know. But we know that she can't cheat to come back because they will catch her. So she has to come back conventionally, the way we did it once upon a time, using some of the modern things they have now, but nothing cheating.
Right.
Can she come back in a year? That's what I want to see. If she's back in the Winter Olympics with 100% knee, then maybe all this ancillary stuff we have is better.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe these electromagnetic machines and these, sleep deprivation knee chambers or whatever the hell they have. Maybe that stuff works, but I still think it's a little fishy that the recovery time has been cut in half,
right,
for some of these injuries. Well,
and the truth be told, I mean, everything's going to keep changing. Soon we're going to be into nanotechnology and DNA modification.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, the people have got to get serious about testing and coming up with these tests that work, but also we got to think of a way to change minds about this whole thing, because part of it is the culture.
Yeah.
Cycling always had a culture of doping. It's like,
I just assumed all cyclists doped.
Right.
Is that wrong?
I think that's right. The fact was that when Lance and when the Ragtag Bears and the '99 team, they came in, it was like they looked around the year before. They had this huge scandal where a bunch of people in the Festina affair, a bunch of people had been popped for drugs coming across the border, and Lance and U.S. Postal figured, man, these guys are blowing by us unless we're doping.
Yeah.
So we're doping too. So everybody, the top 2-3 riders on every team were doping.
And that's the part where I almost feel bad for some of these guys, especially like the Olympic athletes and the cyclists and sports where people are clearly cheating.
Right.
And these guys are trying to do it conventionally, and they're not going to win conventionally.
Correct.
And they talk themselves into this whole thing. Well, it's not like I'm making the choice to cheat. I don't have a choice, and that's why I'm cheating. And I think that's how they talk themselves into the whole thing.
They all talk like that.
Yeah.
And that's why it became so hard for all of them to come back off the lie. Like Tyler Hamilton and Floyd Landis. It took years for them to admit that they had lied, right? Because maybe I lied about this little thing, but not the really big thing. And Floyd even had the Floyd Landis Fairness Fund, right? So it was weird how they slipped into the lie, right, by saying, well, I had to do it, right? And then once they were popped, to undo that lie was very complicated for the mind to reckon with. And I wonder if Lance is still pondering that.
Dr. Frankenstein, you mentioned earlier.
Michele Ferrari.
Great nickname.
Well, he had that reputation as the Dr. Evil of cycling. I mean, I met him. That was an interesting aspect to following Lance in 2009, because the idea was they were going to be totally open. So I said, hey, how come I can't meet Dr. Ferrari? So Lance's Peeps said, okay, fine, go meet Dr. Ferrari. So nobody had really interviewed him. And indeed, they had tried, for people who were filming Lance, they had always tried to keep them away from Dr. Ferrari. Don't film Dr. Ferrari. And I thought, well, I'm going to meet this guy, with a big mustache, always dark, in his laboratory.
With bolts in his neck.
Yeah, exactly. And electricity surging through his veins, or what were left of veins. But, it turns out he's this tremendously charming guy who lives in this country house just outside of Ferrara, Italy. Great smile, super smart. And he's obsessed with athletic performance. He's a scientist. And there's no doubt that he's deeply cynical about the whole game. And so he doesn't have any issues with saying, okay, use this much EPO. How about testosterone here? But it was also, for him, the whole package. A lot of, if you read these emails from Ferrari, a lot of it was, get your weight down, get your weight down, get your weight down, because it was always watts per kilo at lactate threshold, right? Or train this way, train that way. So he was a scientist. He was just obsessed with how can you make these guys go further, faster, longer. End of story. And he didn't care how he did it.
So in a way, they're almost like how a coach feels invested in the player's success because he helped him in A, B, Z, D. So the doctors are like almost competitively living vicariously through this guy that would not have won unless they were doing the things that helped them.
Frankly, when I went and talked to Michele Ferrari, in 2009, you could tell that bottled up inside him was all this resentment that he hadn't been able to talk about how much he had contributed to Lance Armstrong's success. I mean, we all may think of that as a joke now because Michele Ferrari has been reviled as this sort of, human pharmacy.
Yeah.
But in fact, he felt he never got the recognition that he deserved. And he deserved tremendous recognition just in terms of figuring out how to make it work.
So it was almost like if Argo wins Best Picture, but Ben Affleck, nobody's allowed to mention him and he can't come to the ceremony.
That's
He's
right.
just like,
wait a minute.
I directed this.
Exactly.
This is so unfair.
That's right. Exactly right.
Dr. Frankenstein's a nice gimmick. But you said they let him, they let you talk to him.
Which was really interesting.
What this brings us back to the central question of this whole thing is, why did they even have you do this?
Well, that is a good question, and I often wondered about that. They'd hired Don Catlin at the beginning of that year, who's this famous guy in anti-doping circles, to monitor them throughout the year, and then ultimately it didn't work out. And I began to wonder if I was kind of the cinematic Don Catlin. I was there to be sort of the beard for what was going on. I was supposed to, there's like Alex Gibney's here. He's filming everything.
Well, because let's be honest.
He's the investigative guy.
Yeah, you're one of the most famous ones, and you had done the Enron one and
Taxi to the Dark Side.
And Spitzer. Were you working on that at that point or no?
I was still working on it at that point. But
yeah. But you were somebody that, if I heard that you were involved, I'd be like, oh, they're really serious about proving that this is a legit operation.
What was really funny, though, was a lot of people were mystified by it. In fact, and they thought I had signed on just to do the promo job. Like, how much money did they pay Gibney to do the promo job?
This is your sellout
Yeah,
thing
this is my sellout thing.
Wow.
And in fact, Greg LeMond hired a film crew to go and do the anti-Gibney movie at the 2009 tour, and they were always filming me, it's like,
what?
There's Gibney. Yes. So it was like, because one time they were filming some of my camera people, and they asked them, what the hell are you doing? And they said, well, we're just doing something. What's your situation? He said, well, I'm making this film with Alex Gibney. And so what are you guys doing? I said, well, you could say we're doing the anti-Gibney situation. And so what had happened was that I was perceived to be the promo guy, and they were investigating or documenting me doing the Lance Armstrong promo machine. It was weird, right? So
So they thought your spin on it was going to be like when Oprah and Gail go cross country on one of those trips.
That's
and it's just like happy.
That's right.
Happy camera work.
Happy days.
Yeah,
yes.
Everybody comes out
Right.
great.
But sooner or later, I don't know what it is, every one of my movies ends up going to the dark side. So no matter what happens.
Yeah, I was going to say, when I heard you were involved, my first reaction was, like just a weird choice by them. Because if anything was going on, you weren't exactly going to turn your back on it.
Right.
And then second, that if anything did go wrong, I was happy that potentially you were involved. But then to be honest, I forgot you were. This was a couple years ago.
Right.
Yeah. I just assumed like it fell through and they would have screwed you over on the footage. Well, or there were loopholes in there or something. I don't know.
We had to put it aside.
Yeah.
I mean, with a federal investigation going on, where's our last act?
Yeah.
So it wasn't until Lance went on Oprah that everything kicked back in again. And, I would get calls from Lance from time to time, and Lance was reaching out to a number of other people. What should I do? Because he was, he was in the midst of all sorts of legal wrangling. But once the Department of Justice investigation shut down, and a lot of people feel that it was shut down improperly for political reasons, but nobody knows for sure. But once it was shut down, he didn't have that kind of legal liability. So now it was all about the court of public opinion. And how was he going to reckon with what people were saying about him? Because his reputation was terribly important. So he would reach out to a lot of different kinds of people, including me. Like, what do you think I should do? How about this? How about that? It was strange. But suddenly it was like I felt like I was inside my own movie. It was weird.
So how many months are we talking here in 2009?
Well, I mean,
7 months of your life?
They hired,
months?
It wasn't full time, because I would jump in.
Because you were working on other stuff.
Working on other stuff. But, I was there every day for the Tour de France. And by the way, the sport is fantastic. Because we were working for Sony Pictures, we had a lot of resources. I had 10 cameras at the tour.
Yeah, probably nice ones too.
Really good ones, right? Sony cameras.
Yeah. And
we had a camera on the bike of one of Lance's domestiques, one going forward, one underneath the saddle going back, so you can see uniquely inside the peloton. We had a camera on Lance's coach, Johan Brunel. We had tons of cameras. It's fantastic. It was like an action film.
Did it give you a better appreciation for just how grueling that event is, just being involved?
Yeah.
I mean, it must have.
I was exhausted, and I was in the car.
Yeah.
So yeah, it did. I mean, 21 days, it's killer. And you can also see physically, by the end, these guys are so gaunt. Their cheeks are sunken, and they can barely walk. They have huge muscles for riding the bike, but they can barely walk across the street because it does them no good to have those muscles, right? So it's wild what it does to the body. And people say, oh, my God, you got to be careful about EPO because it's dangerous. Well, cycling is dangerous. What it does to your body, it's inhuman.
How famous is he over there?
Oh, he's hugely famous. I mean, and usually for a bad reason. He was like
is he notorious famous? Or?
He was the ugly American.
Right.
I mean, he was the nasty American of Bush America. He was the guy coming over there and beating the French at their own game and doping. I mean, nobody had any illusions in Europe about Lance doping. It was only here. Americans have this peculiar problem. We need superheroes. We can't have gray. It's got to be white or black. He's all good or he's all bad.
LeBron is a great example of that.
Yeah.
He's a hero. The Decision, he's a villain.
Right.
2 years, breaks through, Boston, finals, wins the title, he's a hero.
Right.
And he's been one or the other.
That's right.
With no in-between of anything.
That's right.
You think that fits into these action movies that we make and, way before us, John Wayne.
Right.
Then Clint Eastwood. Then you had Schwarzenegger and Stallone and Bruce Willis. And we've always had these superheroes. Right now, it's weird. We don't really have as many. I guess we have the Fast and Furious guys. But
they keep cranking out the superhero movies. But I mean,
and the superhero movies, yeah. The comic book characters.
We got both strains. But it's like, do you like Superman or do you like Spider-Man? And too often we're prone to the Superman. Superman is all good. I mean, yes, he's kryptonite will make him weak. But Spider-Man is a more flawed character, right? There's a darker side to Spider-Man. But with a lot of our heroes, we seem to need them to be Superman, and then we're so disappointed, when it turns out that actually they're not Superman.
Yeah, why do we get so disappointed?
That's hard to understand. It's like we somehow have so much invested in that perfection. We need that hero to believe that it's possible to be all good. Why do we need that? It's hard to understand. Why couldn't we say, He's a flawed character. He did some good things. He did some bad things. Even Lance was always talking about that. So what about on balance? I did the cancer stuff. What about this? On balance, who am I? In some ways, Lance has got to be, scratching his head and thinking, I gave everybody what they wanted, the perfect story. What did he say in 2005? I'm sorry for you who don't believe in miracles, right? And a lot of people loved him for that, and the French hated him for it. But in 2009, when he comes up Ventoux and stays on the podium, he doesn't win, but he gets third, right? The next day, L'Équipe, who had published this very damning expose of him back in the day called Le Mensonge Armstrong, or the Armstrong Lie, now publishes the big headline. It says, Chapeau le Texan, hats off to the Texan. It's like, it was so good. And suddenly the French, and they loved him probably because he lost, but he lost with grandeur. He lost with guts.
And he's an asshole like most French people.
That's right.
I'm just kidding, France. Only some of you.
Yeah, exactly.
You talked about Lance and the redemption of 2009. It probably should have just ended there, right? Could it have ended there? Is there any way for him to have?
I think.
What was the best escape for him at that point? Why couldn't he have just gone away and ridden into the sunset?
You mean 2005?
I'm sorry, 2005. Yeah.
You're right. That is the big question. Why couldn't he have just said thank you and walked off? Because I think even Lance says if he had done that, nothing would have happened. It was only.
So you really think nothing happens if he walks off? If he rides off in the sunset in 2005, the French give up at that point and they don't care?
Everybody gives up. It's like we've tried, because a lot of stuff had already been published. We've tried, but at the end of the day, what can we do? And nobody seemed to have the gumption to want to go after that story. They were happy to let Lance ride off into the sunset.
It's because of the cancer stuff.
Right.
It was because of Live Strong and much money he'd raised.
He had wrapped the lie in the cancer. Now, I'm not saying the cancer wasn't real. It was real. He raised a lot of money for cancer. But he crossed the line when he began to say things like, how dare you say that I, a cancer survivor, would do anything as dastardly as doping? Yeah. That crossed the big line. But people were willing to accept that, and that was the legend. That was beautiful. So let's let it go.
Isn't that part of what made him the greatest cheater of all time?
Yeah, if you think of cheating as deception.
Using cancer as a way to make people feel guilty about thinking you cheated?
That's right.
That's pretty good.
If you think of cheating as deception, he was the master. Because I think, I accept that Lance is a great athlete, and he beat everybody at their own game. In other words, on a level playing field, meaning everybody was doping, he kicked their butts. So I believe that Lance is a great athlete. But as a cheater or as a liar, his ability to spin that lie was unparalleled. And, one of the things I discovered, one of the things that actually put doubt in my mind, and I began to realize how masterful Lance was at this, was that when this story in L'Équipe came out about the Armstrong Lie, having doped, they did some great investigative reporting about how he had really doped in 1999, and they had the samples to prove it. There was a special commission, that was deputed by the UCI, the cycling organization, to investigate this. Is this really true? We got to get to the bottom of this. And this guy named Emil Vreeman comes out with a report that says, ridiculous. The samples were improperly handled. Lance Armstrong is exonerated. End of story. Well, I find out years later, Lance tells me that when the bill came for Emil Vreeman, Lance paid the bill, which gives you some idea of how heavily entwined, or how inextricably intertwined was the UCI and Lance Armstrong, and how powerful was Lance's defense of this lie. I mean, that's where people are always after him in terms of what he did to go after people who are trying to expose the lie, whether it be Frankie Andreu, Betsy Andreu, David Walsh, the Irish reporter.
And that's why people hated him the most after the fact, that he was so mean to some of those people. And
well, particularly once they found out that he was in fact lying, that he had gone after those people so hard. And, I'll never forget. I mean, in the press conference at the Tour of California, he's talking about Floyd Landis, and he's saying, Floyd Landis, I mean, let's talk about this guy, everybody. Floyd Landis, I mean, I have one word. credibility. You're thinking, really? He's impugning Floyd Landis's credibility.
Yeah.
Well, Floyd Landis at that moment in time was telling the truth.
So you going into this is almost like if this was 1974 and the Nixon White House invites you into,
right?
Hey, come on, we have a little behind the scenes about Dick Nixon.
Oh yeah, and here are some tapes too.
Yeah,
take a listen.
And you're like, what's that recording equipment? Right. Oh, well, it's been here forever.
Yeah, you'll want to listen. Here are some.
How guilty did you feel as this went along? Like you're making a movie about this guy, but you came in with your own preconceived notions. But then the more you spend time with him, you're probably thinking like, oh, he probably did something.
It was a weird position to be in. Like I said, I like Lance, and frankly, I think he's a great athlete. But at the same time, I was never under any illusion that he had doped before. I'm pretty sure he had doped before.
But you didn't 100% know.
No, I didn't 100% know, and I couldn't say it.
Would you have bet your life on it?
No.
Interesting.
No, but it was pretty.
I don't feel like I would have either.
Yeah. Isn't that weird?
He was so adamant about it. He
right.
actually, again, that's why he's the greatest cheater of all time.
Well, and there was that doubt, because I remember I was going to put in a big section about that 1999 thing.
Yeah.
That was going to be a big section in the original film, never mind the later film. And what put me off was that report by Emil Vreeman. And I look back now and think, wow, was I deceived? How masterful. Like there was this report, and the report seems like it's independent, right? It seems like everything's good, no problem, and yet it was just a lie.
I kind of feel this way about Tiger Woods. I'm not accusing him of cheating or not cheating, but he has a doctor who was arrested with all these steroids.
That's right.
Who ends up pleading guilty. He avoids a trial. He just pleads guilty to everything. He had all these athletes that he supplied steroids to, but said Tiger was not one of the athletes. And then the whole thing went away because kind of felt like the media wanted it to go away.
Right.
Nobody really chased it because people wanted to believe Tiger Woods was superhuman. And now here's a guy that we know was like this serial cheater. Now, granted, this was in his domestic life,
right,
but had told all these little white lies all over the place in his personal life. Now he's got this doctor who's tied to the steroid scandal. He hasn't won really at the same rate that he did before that whole thing happened in 2009. And yet nobody, this is kind of what I wrote about in my column to some degree. Like, I feel like we should be able to talk about this.
Yes.
I'm not accusing him or not accusing him, but this is such a big part of sports now that I feel like you and I should be able to discuss this on a podcast without it seeming like we are saying he's cheating. I'm just saying, here are the facts. It makes you wonder. And we always talk about, damn, why do we stick our heads in the sand with the baseball players? Why do we stick our heads in the sand with Lance? We're so stupid. What were we thinking? Like, couldn't you say the same about some of these other things like Tiger?
Totally. I think you're totally right. And we do stick our heads in the sand. And there's a lot of pressure on us to do so because all the corporate sponsors are surrounding, the PGA and everything else. It's like the NBA, the NFL. No, I mean, it's Claude Rains in Casablanca. Gambling in this casino. But we back off. Why do we back off? We should be talking about it all the time because that goes back to that culture thing we were talking about earlier, which is that this stuff doesn't really change unless the culture changes. And so long as we keep having to believe in Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy or Superman, then, it'll keep happening because the illusion will be manufactured over and over and over again. And wouldn't it be great to actually watch a sporting event and not have that doubt? And yet I think for a long time forward now, we're going to have that doubt. Don't you think?
Well, and we also back off because, all right, let's say Tiger did cheat. So now the 2009 U.S. Open, which was one of my favorite sporting events of that decade,
right,
and was totally memorable and one of those moments where you just say, like, I'm glad I was there for that. 40 years from now, I'm going to remember watching that. Now that's ruined.
Right.
I look at the 2004 Red Sox, and I'm still in denial of that team. The Yankee fans will make fun of me and be like, well, Poppy and Manny were cheating. And I spring into that mode of, no, Manny didn't get caught until 2008. We have no evidence he was cheating before then. And Ortiz was on this list, but it could have been any substance. We don't know if it was steroids. It could have been Adderall.
That's right.
The list was blah, blah, blah. And I'm defending these guys.
That's right.
Because I don't want that moment to be taken away.
That's right.
But I think that's what a lot of this is about. And I think with Lance, people really enjoyed not just the fact that he was kicking the French's ass and that the French were really pissy about it, which was great because Americans love when the French get riled up. And then on top of it, the cancer thing and Live Strong and the money he was raising and, the fact that he came back from what he came back from. And
it gives everybody hope. It's like he's the ultimate symbol of hope. And everybody was too invested in that to question it. But, here's a question, and it came out of your column that I kind of wonder about because I keep rolling it over in my mind. And it comes up with George Hincapie, one of Lance's domestiques, who when he finally said Lance doped, everything turned. But he was the guy that always kept his head down, didn't proclaim I never doped. And you talked about that a little bit in your column. Like, what's the difference between somebody who comes out and says, I have never doped, how dare you say that I doped, and the guy who's doping but is just keeping his head down like a lot of people in cycling did, like Induran and others, and just go along? Is it any better? Or what do we think?
It's almost like you're more of a liar when you go out of your way to say you didn't dope, right?
Right.
It almost makes it worse.
For some reason, it really gets under your skin. It's like you're looking me in the eye and lying to me rather than avoiding my gaze.
I think Piazza is a good example of this. Piazza, everybody thought was cheating, never caught. No real hardcore evidence other than he was a really low draft pick in high school, kind of was a late bloomer professionally. There were always rumors like he had zits on his back or, like stupid steroid telltale. But nobody really knew. He played in an era where everybody cheated.
Right.
He peaked and then he kind of crashed a little bit and his body broke down, which tends to happen to steroid guys. But again, we don't know. And then he said in his book, which I read, and he tackled it. He didn't address it nearly as prolifically as I wanted him to. Right. But he said, like, hey, look, creatine was legal when I played. And they had these creatine protein power shakes that I think now they're not even legal, but back then they were. And I took them because they were legal. There were no rules against it. You could buy them in stores. I wasn't paying some dude on the street corner for it. I was going into a store and buying them and drinking them, and they made me feel better.
Right.
So why isn't he in the Hall of Fame then? He didn't cheat. Did he cheat? I don't know. If he drank those power shakes and that's all he did, is that cheating?
Well, and you raised the Hall of Fame. I mean, that's a big point. Now the Hall of Fame has become this moral barometer.
I hate it. It's a museum. It's not a moral barometer.
Right.
I'm supposed to be able to take my son there and teach him about all the best players ever.
Right.
And Barry Bonds isn't in there. And Pete Rose isn't in there. And
right.
Clemens isn't going to be in there. It's like, what do we have then?
Right.
Just have a plaque and put an asterisk on it.
Correct. I think the asterisk is a pretty good way to go. And then maybe we get to the point where it's all about the cover-up. The cover-up is really the bad crime, I think.
I agree. It's like Palmero lying.
That's right.
Yeah.
And Clemens looking everybody in the eye
right.
and saying, how dare you? How dare you accuse me?
The Clemens things was doubly painful for Boston fans because he left. He signed with Toronto. He was battled being in and out of shape. Last contract wasn't great. Had a big contract run last 3 months. Then he ditched us and went to Toronto. Got in great shape. Won 2 straight Cy Youngs. And we took it so personally, like, oh, this guy dogged it for us. And the reality was he's probably just started cheating when he got to Toronto.
That's right.
And now I kind of feel weirdly better about the whole thing.
Right.
I was if he had cheated for us, that would have sucked.
Roger Clemens.
Yeah.
Right. How many people did he strike out in that one game when he was with Boston?
He did it twice. He did 20 two times.
That's right.
But the second time might have been cheating. But
right.
The cancer thing, you've heard people make the argument with Lance Armstrong that even though he cheated and disgraced cycling and was a liar and goes down as the greatest cheater of all time and one of the most morally, I don't want to say reprehensible, but dubious great superstars. What he did for cancer and raising awareness and all the money he raised was worth it. That they would take that trade-off. You have the cancer here, the cancer research and money and all that stuff here, and then you have the bad stuff here, and this is still worth more than this. Do you agree with that?
No. But I do agree that you can't go so far as deny all the good that Lance did for cancer survivors. He did a tremendous amount of good, and he raised a tremendous amount of money. Let's just say that he did that. Yeah. But let's not put them on some kind of scale. It is interesting, the writer Dan Coyle, who wrote a great book, who wrote the Tyler Hamilton book with Tyler and also wrote Lance Armstrong's War, sent me to this website about a psychologist who said, we're hardwired for moral mediocrity. That the more good we do, the more entitled we feel to do bad stuff. Right. It's like you go jogging, for 2 hours one Saturday, and you come home and you eat a bag of Doritos because you think you're entitled. And so, it gets to be that place. And I don't think we can begin to admire people who are making that balance. We have to look at the actions and say, this is good. Money raised for cancer, good. Looking everybody in the face and lying to us and going after people who are trying to tell the truth, bad. Yeah. Let's keep them separate.
And they don't outweigh each other. I agree with that. Do we make too big of a deal about PDs? This is a two-part question. Part one, Lance won all those Tour de France's. Everybody he beat was cheating.
Right.
So he was the best of all the cheaters. Now, if you remove the drugs from the equation for everybody, he's probably still going to win, I would guess. Maybe I'm naive.
Probably, but we don't know. There are people who say those drugs affect everybody differently.
True.
But at the same time, I think that's why Lance came back in 2009. That was his rationale. It's like, oh, yeah, they said I was cheating all those years. I'm going to come back clean and I'll still beat people. But so, I don't know the answer to that question. I think that's the problem. I think the asterisk kind of solves that problem. It's kind of saying to everybody, here's the asterisk. It's a wink and a nod that we're saying this guy won or this team won, because we don't know. It's like
I heard somebody told me once that Lance's lungs are like just unbelievable. And they said if you take what he already had and then you did what he was doing, you basically created this superhuman. And what he could do with a bicycle, like distance didn't matter, the hail didn't matter, nothing mattered because he was basically invincible when you added the stuff. And I wonder for him, this is the part with PDs that you and I will never understand, as will anybody who's not an athlete. Like, you're this athlete, you're trying to be the best you can be, and you take this one thing, and now all of a sudden you've hit the point that you always wanted to hit. It's like, oh, look at that giant hill. I'm going right up it. This is going to be great. And you're just superhuman. And I do wonder if that's part of it with this whole thing. Does that make sense?
I'm
not even talking about the winning. I'm just talking about the personal satisfaction of being able to do stuff that you've always wanted to do.
Right.
It's like that movie with Bradley Cooper, Limitless. That was secretly good.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But and that Limitless is a great one. A lot of people were telling me to watch that as I was kind of grappling with the whole Lance Armstrong thing. But then there was one of Lance's teammates in '99, Jonathan Vaughters, who's now a coach for Garmin. He talked about how he won on Mont Ventoux, this great mountain that's part of cycling lore, when he was doped to the gills on EPO. And it was a weird feeling for him. He got to do something that he had never done before, and he kicked everybody's butt, right? But at the top, he sort of stood there with a kind of quizzical look in his face, like, was that me, or did the drug just carry me up the mountain?
Yeah.
And
he felt guilty.
Yeah, so he did. He felt guilty, and he felt a little bit shamed and dirty. It's like, what's going on here? Not everybody feels that way. I think Lance takes a much more practical view. It's like, screw it. If everybody else is doping, I'm doping too. End of story. You don't bring, a knife to a gunfight. If you ain't cheating, you ain't trying, I guess is the NASCAR slogan. So I don't know. I mean, that bit about Lance's lungs and his heart, which everybody used to talk about, if you compare those to you or me, he's a gargantuan physical specimen. Yeah. But the fact is, cyclists are pre-selected for that. They all have big lungs. They all have a big engine. You can't do that sport unless you do. So at that level, I don't think Lance is physically, he's not a miracle like he was saying.
Well, what about the part when people talk about, well, what is cheating, what isn't cheating, and what is enhancement, what is performance enhancement, and what isn't. So I'm a pitcher. I blow up my arm. They pull a ligament out of some dead guy. They sew it into my arm. I can pitch again.
That's right.
That's legal.
Right.
I can't write anything in the morning unless I have 20 ounces of coffee. Caffeine.
Right.
That's legal. It's fine. We like coffee. All of us like coffee. Lance takes HGH. Let's say Lance takes HGH.
Right.
Which is given to patients from age 60 and over when they're, to help them recover faster from surgeries or to just feel better or whatever.
Well, they used to give EPO to cancer patients.
They give EPO to cancer patients.
Red blood cells.
These are things that have been given to people to make them feel better. But yet with athletes, we draw the line and we say, no, they can't do that. That's bad. We can't do that. But if Lance blew out his knee, he could put a dead guy's ligament in the knee and that's fine. We've never really made sense of what makes sense and what doesn't make sense.
I agree. And that's what led somebody like Ferrari to be totally cynical. It was like they keep making up these rules. You can sleep in an altitude tent, but you can't take EPO. What sense does that make?
Right.
But on the other hand, I think we can say about cheating that it's whether you play by the rules or not. It's like, here's the rule. Are you obeying the rule or are you not obeying the rule?
Yeah.
And you
all
can
the other
say,
guys are obeying it and you're not.
Right. Or maybe a bunch of them aren't obeying the rule, but it doesn't mean that nobody's cheating because everybody's cheating, right? Everybody's still breaking the rule. We gotta decide what that means. We can't just wink and nod and say, well, the rules don't matter then. If we're looking at a sport, you wouldn't want, if you're playing an NFL game, and you wouldn't want the home team to be able to literally tip the field.
True.
So that you're going to have to march upfield, if you were the opposing team. So
that would be cool, though. Belichick would definitely do that.
He would definitely be all over that, don't you think? Okay, guys, try this one.
Guys, yeah. All right, I'll take the wind and the tilted field. I'm doing that. Yeah, I don't know where this stuff's going because the reality is they're going to keep coming up with better and better ways to make athletes good. And, Kobe went to Germany last year and did some procedure that wasn't legal in the United States, at least at the time he did it, and was legal in Germany, and he did it. And he had his best offensive season in 5 years before he got hurt. And there was no rule against doing that.
Right.
Now, the next guy, let's say Dwight Howard, could decide there could be some new rule where you take the blood from your children, you take their hemoglobin, and you inject it in your knee, and that works 1,000 times better, and he does that, and there's no rule against that. We don't know where any of this stuff is going, but I have a feeling it's going to get more and more and more and more complicated.
No doubt. And that's where we got to decide whether we want amateur athletics or we want pro wrestling, and which one is it going to be? Because, at the end of the day, one way to help solve this is to make sure that the leagues don't police themselves. I mean, the idea that the UCI is doing its own testing for cycling is ridiculous.
Yeah.
To the extent that the leagues all feel the pressure from us that they have to find independent third-party organizations to do the testing and the policing that they don't have any control over, that would be interesting. But as long as they're in control of those things, or even the players' unions, are demanding restrictions that allow them to cheat in effect, we gotta, as fans, we gotta say, well, look, we'll suffer for a few years so that we don't have the spectacular performances if you lay this out, so that we can finally believe that there's a level playing field here.
There's two parts here. There's the belief part, and this is what I wrote about in February. Just like most of my conversations were turning into, do you think he's cheating?
Right.
How long do you think he's been cheating?
That's
what do you
right.
think he does? And it's just like, I don't want to spend my time talking about that.
That's right.
And then, I think there's two different types of athletic cheating. One is like baseball, cycling, basketball, tennis, where you're cheating for the result, but you can't hurt anybody.
Right.
Then you have football, hockey,
Yes.
boxing, and
Right.
MMA. You're cheating and you can hurt somebody.
That's right.
And if you build yourself up so you're running faster and you're much stronger than you were, and you knock somebody out and you couldn't have done that the other way, that's a different story. And that's why I think, like with football, they got to figure it out, because I think it's a huge part of why so many guys are getting hurt now.
Well,
I think these guys are too big and too fast.
Too big and too fast, and they're armed with weapons. I mean, the helmets, people I know have talked about how, the NFL used to have meetings about how they didn't really want to change the helmets because the sound they made was so good for television.
Yep.
Right? And they're killing people.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that then becomes a real moral issue. And that was one of the things that got people onto the EPO issue in cycling, too. People were dying, when nobody really knew what they were doing. That's where it becomes a big social issue. And then you've got kids. Like, do you want kids, bulking up with, for Little League?
Right.
Right? I remember when I was living in Glendale, I learned, my neighbor told me that there was a big betting scandal on Glendale Little League. People were betting up to like $500 a game.
Wow.
I mean, imagine the pressure that would put on kids if your parents are betting like $500 a game.
I want to start betting on my daughter's under-9 soccer games. I didn't even think of that. That's a great idea.
Yeah.
Last question. You can cheat with what you're doing. They come up with some sort of PD that raises creativity. It really works well for filmmakers. You're going to be more prolific. You're going to be able to do everything faster. You're going to have more stamina. You're going to be able to work 19-hour days and not even feel it the next day. But everybody agrees not to take it. Do you think about taking it?
Let me get back to you on that. I don't know. I mean, I'd like to say no, but you just I remember my son, was briefly on a kind of Ritalin called Concerta, to help him focus. And I realized as he was taking it that actually all his symptoms were my symptoms. And so I began to take it for a while too, because it did help me focus. I had some kind of attention deficit disorder, as he did, right?
Yeah.
And I had learned to compensate, as you probably have, by doing way too many projects at the same time.
Yeah.
Right? And that would allow you to hyper-focus. So I started taking Concerta for a while, sort of like Bradley Cooper, and it did make me focus on things in an unbelievably powerful way.
You have to give back your Oscar now.
Yeah. But what it did do also, and my son learned this as well, and he learned it first and then he taught me, which was it was like having blinders on.
Yeah.
And so it eliminated the kind of peripheral vision that allowed you to see things that you might not otherwise do, and that this focus somehow impeded the creative process in a way.
Interesting.
So it ended up not being so valuable after all.
Because I've heard that, especially the younger generation. I've been out of college now for 20 plus years, but I know college kids, a lot of them take Adderall, helps them focus, gives them more attention when they're working on a paper until 3 a.m. and stuff like that. And I was joking once about some football player who claimed he'd failed a test for Adderall. All these guys failed tests for not Adderall. They claimed it was Adderall, but in my opinion, I think the NFL doesn't. The agreement they have with the NFL is that the NFL doesn't say why you failed the test. So it's up to the player then to just say whatever reason he wants to come up with, and they all say Adderall. So who knows? But these college kids, they were like, yeah, everyone takes Adderall. I don't know where you've been, old man. And I was like, really? I don't feel like that would be that good for you. The only thing I've ever taken is coffee and marijuana. to make my work better.
Yeah.
And I've retired from one of them, not coffee.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. But I don't know. I think
I'm familiar with those helps for making the work better, and they do work. But I don't know either. I mean, I think that in some ways, you'd like to believe that it's just, you'd like to believe you could go au naturel. But at the same time, I don't know. The world is a mysterious place, and it's hard to know what makes what's liberating what you have within, and what's, pulling your chain in some artificial way. Now I'm getting off in some
Well, it's funny that we don't blame, bands for doing drugs and making their best albums when they were on LSD. And,
That's right.
And, whoever for being on cocaine when they did their funniest movie and whatever. Like,
I'm not
we don't
sure
have that stuff.
Fact is, I'm not sure they always did. I mean, I think drugs probably were liberating to Bob Dylan. You can look at those lyrics, and Bob will deny it, but
for the most part, probably damaging.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, at the end, I mean, I think they do. I took LSD. I think it expanded my horizons. I do. I think otherwise, I wouldn't imagine things the way I would if I hadn't. I think it was a mind expander. Would I do it every day? I probably wouldn't be speaking English if I did.
I'm on LSD right now.
Right, excellent. Where are you going?
And EPO.
Right.
And I did.
You should be able. Your trip should be longer then.
I took PEDs and I injected my daughter's blood into my knees to walk better. Alex Gibney, I look forward to seeing this documentary whenever it comes out.
Me too.
What year will it be, you think?
I don't know.
Who knows?
I'm pretty sure it'll be this year.
Pretty sure it'll be this year, 2013.
It'll definitely be this year.
All right, so we're taping this in April 2013, so by the time you hear this, that means the movie is coming out. And this is our way of proactively promoting it, I guess.
Indeed.
Good luck.
Thanks, man.
Thank you.
So I get the sign off. Whoa!
Thank you for downloading the BS Report with Bill Simmons.
Too much fun.
Check out more podcasts at the iTunes Music Store or at Podcenter at ESPNRadio.com.
Peace out.
Hey, what you got there, Golick?
The new Subway Chipotle chicken melt with guacamole.
Man, that looks good.
Yeah, this new guac is really bringing the flavor.
Got one for me too, right?
Well, yes and no. Mostly no. Well, really, all no.
Try the irresistible new Subway Chipotle chicken melt with guacamole, juicy grilled chicken strips with Monterey cheddar, Chipotle Southwest sauce, and new guacamole made from ripe Hass avocados with just a hint of jalapeno. Subway, eat fresh.